Welcome to today's Explainer. We're jumping right into the truly fascinating evolution of money. But we're starting from a very specific, absolutely crucial turning point in economic history. I'm talking about the exact moment humanity collectively threw its hands up and realized that direct barter was just, well, too clunky to sustain. Between 8000 BCE and 2000 BCE, as the Neolithic Revolution took hold and scattered bands of humans started forming large settled communities, people desperately needed a consistent medium of exchange. It wasn't just about trading a spear for a clay pot anymore. Society was getting complicated. So let's dive into exactly how we first started standardizing the very concept of value. Here is our roadmap for today. We'll start by looking beyond direct barter. Then we'll examine livestock, grain, and salt. After that, we'll see how geography shapes the currency, unpack 3 massive structural challenges, and finally, look at the shift to metal. All right, Section 1, Beyond Direct Barter. Let's look at how these early communities bypassed what economists call the chaotic double coincidence of wants. That's that incredibly frustrating scenario where, to make a trade, you have to find someone who not only has what you want, but who also wants exactly what you have. It's a total logistical nightmare that early humans simply had to solve to survive. Now, think about the profound difference in how we perceive value today versus back then. Modern fiat currency, the cash in your physical wallet or those digits floating around in your banking app, relies entirely on government authority, immense trust, and complex legal frameworks to hold its value. If the system fails, it's literally just paper and pixels. But ancient money couldn't rely on any of that. It required intrinsic usefulness, meaning the money itself had to be something you could actually eat, wear, or use for grueling physical labor. And that brings us to the fundamental breakthrough here, intrinsic value. Commodity money was a total game changer precisely because it was inherently valuable, completely independent of its role in a trade transaction. This allowed early economies to function entirely without central banks, royal mints, or complex legal frameworks dictating what things were worth. Imagine being able to trade confidently without needing a government to back your funds. You accepted an item because, worst case scenario, if the local economy just collapsed tomorrow, you could literally use your money to survive the winter. Moving on to Section 2, Livestock, Grain, and Salt. Let's see how this intrinsic value played out in practice, with the big 3 practical goods of early agricultural societies. First up is livestock. This was absolutely one of the earliest forms of recognized transferable wealth, especially in ancient Mesopotamia and across sprawling Indo-European cultures. A cow or a sheep wasn't just a static, lifeless coin. It was a highly valuable, living, breathing asset. Think about the utility here. It produces milk daily, it pulls the heavy plow, and eventually it provides meat and leather. Plus, and this is key, animals breed, so it effectively served as ancient self-replicating wealth. Your bank account could literally grow itself out in the pasture. And what's truly fascinating is the etymology behind this. The cultural impact of livestock as an everyday currency was so deeply ingrained in places like ancient Rome that our modern concept of money comes directly from ancient cows. The Latin word for money, pecunia, derives straight from the word pecus, which translates to cattle. So every single time you talk about having a pecuniary interest in a business deal today, you are unknowingly echoing the muddy, bustling, ancient cattle markets of Rome. How cool is that? Next up, we have grain. In massively influential places like Egypt and Mesopotamia around 3000 BCE, surplus grain, specifically barley, was so universally desired to settle basic debts that it actually became a standard unit of account. You literally paid your laborers in buckets of barley simply because of its undeniable, life-sustaining utility. Everyone needed to eat, right? That made a basket of barley as universally accepted back then as a crisp $100 bill is today. You didn't have to convince someone it had value. Their hungry stomach did that for you. Just picture the scale of that operation for a second. Because grain was literally money, it had to be rigorously protected, measured, and managed. These ancient grain storage facilities, typically run by massive temples or early state authorities, effectively functioned as the world's very first proto-banking institutions. You'd deposit your surplus grain after a harvest, and the temple scribes would carefully keep a ledger of your wealth. It's the exact blueprint for modern banking, just operating with tiny seeds instead of digital dollars. Rounding out the big 3 is salt. Now today, salt is incredibly cheap. You grab a giant container at the store for, a few bucks? But before the invention of refrigeration, it was an absolute non-negotiable necessity for food preservation. If you couldn't salt your meat, it spoiled and you starved. Simple as that. It was so critically important for basic survival that it became a heavily guarded, state-controlled commodity in ancient China. And across the unforgiving trans-Saharan trade routes, blocks of salt were traded directly, ounce, for solid gold. It wasn't just a seasoning, it was a fundamental economic pillar of civilization.
Okay, Section 3, Geography shapes the currency. Money wasn't invented in a vacuum. It was organically shaped by highly specific local environments.
The materials different cultures chose really prove that money acts as a powerful social construct. Look at the coastal regions of Africa and Asia. They used beautiful cowrie shells because of their aesthetic appeal and relative local scarcity. Then look at the island of Yap in the Pacific. They used these massive, incredibly heavy stone discs called rice stones. These stones had zero practical utility. You can't eat them, you can't wear them, but they derived their immense value from the sheer physical effort required to quarry them and transport them across the treacherous ocean. The community just kept a shared mental ledger of who owned which stone. It's a fascinating ancient precursor to the complex digital ledgers and blockchains we use today. Meanwhile, as we mentioned, across the Sahara, geographic scarcity elevated simple salt to a monetary status equal to gold. Let's move to Section 4, 3 massive structural challenges. Because this early, resourceful economic system eventually hit a massive breaking point. I really want you to think about this. Why on earth did humanity abandon payment systems that provided actual food, immense physical labor, and life-saving utility? If the concept of intrinsic value was so bulletproof, why didn't it last forever? Well, the answer lies in 3 massive structural challenges that created an unbearable amount of economic friction as societies started to grow and specialize. Those challenges are durability, portability, and divisibility. Let's walk through them. First up, durability. Think about agricultural goods. Grain fundamentally fails as a reliable long-term store of value because it's highly perishable. Imagine the profound anxiety of knowing that your entire life savings could literally rot away after an unexpectedly heavy rainstorm. Or picture waking up to find your hard-earned wealth completely devoured by a sudden swarm of pests. If you can't confidently store your wealth to protect your family in the future, your entire economic system is incredibly fragile. Second, portability was an absolute nightmare for merchants. Livestock was undeniably valuable, sure, but driving a massive herd of cattle across a continent just to settle a major trade debt, that is physically exhausting for everyone involved. And beyond that, it's highly, highly risky. The animals you're using as money can suddenly get sick, they can break a leg in a ditch, or they can easily get lost or stolen during a long journey. You are risking your entire capital every single time you attempt to move it from point A to point B. And then there's the most immediate, frustrating daily hurdle of all: divisibility. Just imagine the absolute absurdity of trying to make small change for a single loaf of bread using a live 1,000-pound cow. You can't exactly just slice off a tiny piece of the cow to buy an apple without entirely destroying the cow's value as a living, milk-producing asset. The sheer friction of trying to conduct daily, small-scale trade with indivisible goods was just way too high a burden for a growing society. Which brings us to Section 5, the shift to metal. The escalating tension between a currency's physical usefulness and its economic efficiency absolutely had to be resolved. Society collectively realized that for a currency to truly work at a much larger global scale, it had to undergo a massive psychological transition. It had to move away from being physically useful to being a purely abstract, standardized representation of value. You couldn't have money that rots in the rain, and you couldn't have money that constantly needs to be fed and watered. You needed money that just sits there, completely inert, and holds its value flawlessly over time. This was a profound philosophical shift. It took immense communal trust for humans to agree that a relatively useless, shiny piece of metal had extreme value simply because everyone collectively agreed that it did. That being said, the use of livestock, grain, and salt were heroic first steps in human history. They successfully standardized value for the very first time and powerfully bridged the gap between the chaotic mess of direct barter and the incredibly sophisticated financial systems we rely on today. But those structural inefficiencies we just discussed, the glaring lack of durability, portability, and divisibility, created an immense pressure that practically forced human society to evolve its technology of money. So to solve the rotting grain and the stubborn, heavy cows, the ancient world turned to a new material that would utterly dominate global trade for the next several millennia: metal. Metal is incredibly durable, it's highly portable, and crucially, you can easily melt it down and divide it into exact, tiny, perfectly standardized coins. It was the ultimate technological upgrade for human commerce. So I'll leave you with this final provocative thought. If we deliberately detached value from physical survival thousands of years ago, realizing our money doesn't actually need to be eaten or worn, what are the true limits of abstract money as we look to the future? From heavy cows to tiny metal coins to paper bills to completely invisible digital numbers pinging across servers, how abstract can value truly become? Thanks for joining me on today's Explainer, and keep questioning the value of everything around you.